This week, we are continuing our conversation with Sue Becker from the Bread Beckers, located in Woodstock, Georgia. And if you have not yet listened to last week's episode, you may want to make sure that you go back and listen to that one, and even consider stopping this episode now and going back and listening so that you can make sure that you are caught up with our conversation with the things that we are talking about. Thank you for joining us this week, and if you have not yet left us a review on iTunes, please make sure that you take a little bit of time and go and do that for us. We really appreciate it.
This is April.
And this is Tiffany.
And you're listening to the Tea of Life podcast.
We hope that you enjoy listening today as we dive into this week's episode.
Number 4 is fresh fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. We need to start eating them and make a conscious effort. And I have to make a conscious effort just as much as anybody. I don't want anyone listening to me to think I'm a purist and I never deviate and I never eat something junky and I don't grab the chips or crackers instead of an apple because that's what I recommend. Right. I have to make a conscious effort. Go, I had my bread, but I didn't eat, fruit.
Yeah.
And, we just, and smoothie, getting back to that, it's a great way to, get your fruit in there. Mm-hmm. But like the other day, I wanted something and I was like, what do I want? Well, my friend had just picked me a cup of blueberries and I just sat down and ate the blueberries, nice. Or eat an apple instead of an apple flavored fruit bar, eat the banana and drink your water. Make an effort. I think vegetables are a little harder for kid, to get on your plate, but, have the salad around or broccoli or, make those choices. Sometimes we have to make conscious efforts. Put a little piece of fruit on there, on the side plate or go for that. And I tell moms all the time, you as well as your children will eat the easiest thing available. Mm-hmm. If you have a bowl of fruit out all the time, I just bought a big bag of cherries. They're in season, and I had them sitting on the counter, and I came back 2 days later, and they weren't there. And that's because my son ate them, my husband ate them, and I ate them. Yeah. They were there. I had them washed, ready. There's no fruit, and there's chips in the cabinet. Or even if there is fruit and chips or something chunky in the cabinet, that's easy to sit down and just munch and eat the whole bag without even thinking, and it doesn't drip on your hands. You don't have to spit the seeds out. You know what I'm saying? It's easier just to consume it and be done with it. Whereas fruit's a little harder. So make it more available. Try not to have the junky options around unless you want to cave. You're going to cave. And we have them. We have a few things, not too many. And but we do. And I know summertime's big time for taking the chips and the soda on the picnic. Get those fruits and vegetables in there. And think about putting vegetables in a smoothie. I add a big handful of salad greens to my smoothie. You don't taste it at all. And there I've gotten a whole salad greens in my smoothie, especially the fruity smoothies. That was a mouthful. So, make those efforts. I teach a dehydration class and show you how to make ways to make fun snacks that your kids easy to throw in a lunchbox, dried apples. I dehydrate spinach, which a lot of people don't think about. And then I powder it. So it says powder. Tablespoon of that powder, throw it in berries with a little squeeze of honey, little bit of juice just to get some liquid there. Put in that tablespoon of spinach powder. That tablespoon of spinach powder is like a cup of fresh spinach. My grandkids called it my sherbet. They never knew the green was in there. Wow. Now, my daughter does something with fresh pineapple, fresh banana, and I freeze them so that it's slushy. Little bit of orange juice. Throw in the tablespoon of spinach powder. Of course, now it's green. She calls it alt smoothie. What's the other green one? Shrek smoothie. Anyway, so those are some fun things you can do, and I help you. But this isn't rocket science. Most of us can do this. I bet anybody listening is going to go, that's not anything very profound. It's not. It's not. The whole world, the grocery store is full of food. We just have to start going for it. So that's number 4. Number 5, at some point, and by this point, you're going to be so in love with the way you feel that you're going to go, you know what? When I ate that ice cream or that dessert, and you kind of feel ill. In fact, my husband goes, don't eat that. All I'm going to hear all the way home is, why did I do that? I feel so sick. So get rid of the junk. Start reading labels and go, you know what? This is not worth the compromise. That I'm going to feel yucky.
It's not worth the compromise.
No, it's not. And I'll never forget, we went to a party one time. We'd been doing this for years, had no sinus congestion. Now, I lived with postnasal drip. That was always this nasty mucus down and always a stuffy nose. At night, I could not sleep without an antihistamine. It was just impossible. And we had been doing the bread, and I didn't have any of that, and it was so exciting. We went to this party, and I made great choices the whole night. Right before we left, there were these brownies, these gooey brownies. And they didn't even appeal to me the whole night. And it was almost like, I was like, I'm going to miss that. I got one and I ate it on the way home. Before we got home, and I wasn't that far from home, I had all this crud starting in the back of my throat. And my first thought was, golly, is my immune system not strong enough that I can't even do something like that? And I'm, that just this one little bite. And then this is what came to me. I never noticed before what caused such congestion because I lived like that. So that was a real awakening for me is, look how this little bit of something causes this mucus and congestion. Now it was gone by morning because I had pancakes or bread or whatever. And we live with stuff like this that we don't notice that are causing those reactions because we live that way. So here I was, it was a drastic difference in I'm never congested and now I had this one little thing and now I noticed, whereas when you stay congested, you don't notice that brownie did that. You don't notice that ice cream that you did that. You don't notice that you just live like that and you just think that's the norm and it's not. So at some point we just got to get rid of some of those junky things. And by this point, if you're doing it for a while, you love the way you feel, you're so happy, and you don't crave those things, so it makes it a whole lot easier. I get sad when I read these things of, breaking your sugar addiction. It may be hard for a couple weeks. And I'm like, not if you give your body the right things first. That's just my philosophy over everything. Yeah, supplementation and medicine might be necessary time, but why not start with giving your body what it needs first? Then my next two really don't apply to food at all, but they are about healthy living, exercise. We were born to work. We were placed in the garden from the very beginning, and God said, tend the garden. If you've ever gardened without machinery, it is hard work. We're made to work. We have muscles that need to move. Our body depends on it to be healthy. One of the saddest things I think ever is the older we get, we tend to just become not active, and that's horrible. Unfortunately, our society now is more sedative. Our work, we sit here at desks and computers. We don't get outside. We need sunshine, but we need to move. And it can be a walk. I mean, Jesus didn't go to exercise class. They didn't, people years ago, they didn't need to. Unfortunately, we have to look for ways. So we have to go to the spin class or whatever, or just walk, walk
yoga.
a lot.
I think Jesus did yoga.
You think so? Maybe.
I think so. I guess.
He prayed, but they walked, you know what I'm saying? They gardened, they farmed, they fished. Right. This isn't just about trying to be body beautiful. I'm just 62. I realize I'm never going to look 21 again. Never. It's not going to happen. But it's about moving, keeping my body moving, keeping my muscle strength. I just want to be able to do what God wants me to do till the day I die. He took Moses to the top of the mountain. I don't think he transported him. Moses hiked up there. It was 120, and God showed him the promised land and said, I'm taking you home. And that's what I want to be able to do. And I just want to be able to move and be about God's business till he takes me home. I see older people lose their balance. And I think there are some things we have to be more careful of when we get older. And I think there are some natural aging things, but I was getting to where I just didn't feel quite comfortable. So I started taking a bar class, which is all about toning your muscles and getting that balance back. And so, I've started doing things like that. But when my kids were young, it was just chasing them and going for a walk. That's about all I had time to do. So I think just using those muscles. One thing that people don't realize that's so important to health is our lymph system. And it doesn't have a pump like our circulatory system. It depends on movement. So when I see these elderly people that can't move, this is not good. Or people that sit all the time. Like when you sit, why does fluid collect in your legs? Get up, move. And there's simple things you can do. I stretch every day, several times a day usually. I do stretches because I want to stay flexible. I try to do little things, resistance things, little bit of weight things. So those are things you can do, but it's so important to keep that lymph moving, and it's dependent on deep breathing, which exercise helps. That's another thing. The more we sit, the more we're not moving. We don't take those deep breaths. So that's one thing we can just start taking deep breaths. Bowel movement every day helps your lymph move, and then exercise that gets movement gets that lymph moving, and it's important. The things your bodies have pulled off, that's that elimination system. So that's a big key player for me is exercise, get moving. We just a walk. You just a squat, stretch, reach over and touch your toes. I want to be able to touch my toes till the day I die. And move and do some balance.
And be able to
things.
get back up.
And get back up.
Yeah. I just do things like, I read in one of my courses that I took, every day you should rotate your shoulders. And how many people have stiff joints, stiff muscles? And, some of it is...
I'm like sitting here
I
thinking,
know,
I need to
me
move
too.
now.
I'm like,
Sitting up straight.
When I go when we walk,
You do
when I walk,
all kinds of-
seriously, I'm always
moving.
I'm always like that. It says mostly multitasking, but I'm like, here, I'm doing my shoulder. I'm doing my arms and I go bigger circles. I must look like a darn fool walking up and down the
I know, I do too.
road, but
No, it's
who cares?
It's so important.
I feel
it's
good.
so important. So anyway, that's that. And then my last one sounds like a contradiction to what I just said about keeping moving and exercising and working. It's called resting. Americans, most of the world doesn't rest anymore. And God created rest for us. It's not a legal thing.
I love rest.
It's I do too. And there's 2 rests that I advocate. A lot of us talk about 6 days you shall work and 1 day you shall rest. That's a focus for a lot of us, and that's so important, of just taking that time to go, you know what, Lord? First of all, it's a trust thing. It's saying, if I don't work today, I'll be all right. God is still going to provide. I don't have to do this. And in fact, I was just reading a law about the whole 7 years letting the land lay fallow. And I was thinking about that. And if you read through that, it was like, so you're going to eat the overproduction, what you provided in your 6th year, you're going to eat that your whole 7th year. But then in your 8th year, you're eating it there too until the harvest comes in. And I'm like, wow, this is some pretty heavy duty trusting the Lord that you're going to provide so much on that 6th year, So I got to thinking about that. How many of us just don't rest because we think we have to keep going? One of my favorite books years ago that I read to my children was Farmer Boy. It's in the Little House on the Prairie books. I liked it the best, of her story of her husband, Almanzo, and his childhood. And they were farmers and dairy farmers and everything. And the whole book was, he loved to eat. And it was all about what they had for food and everything. But what stuck with me so much is that they rested on the Sabbath. But their rest is you could do nothing. They had to sit by the fire and do nothing. He couldn't play. He did nothing. He sat in a chair with the rest of the family. And what stuck with me is it talked about how he could not wait until he had to get up and milk the cows that evening. Because then he would get to do something. But what hit me there is how many of us dread Monday because we didn't rest on Sunday. How much more will we look forward to, yes, I get to milk the cows today, because we rested. I'm not advocating don't do anything but sit in a chair. I'm not saying that. But fellowship, go for a walk, read a book, don't do laundry, and don't feel guilty about it. That's your day, and God gave us that day. How many days do I go, I really should be doing laundry. I really should be cleaning my house. I really should be doing this. This is a day you go, no, I really shouldn't be doing any of that. Yes, Lord, yes. And, I'm all about getting your ox out of a ditch. I understand that one. And if you don't know what I'm referring to, that was Jesus's thing. When the Pharisees tried to get all legalistic, he goes, okay, how many of you, if your ox is in a ditch, you get it out? And I've had to get my ox out of a ditch several times, but I always come back to, okay, so that's done. I'm resting the next time. And so that's one rest. We need to take that and not look at it as, I can't do this. I think as Christians, we think, got to get all legalistic. I can't do this, I can't do that. How about I get to read a book today, I get to visit my children, I get to just lay on a bed and do nothing, whatever. And that's our rest. But then the rest that many of us don't think about is every 24 hours, there's a rest. And it's called nighttime. It's called our sleeping time. That's when the body's healing. We need to be careful to let ourselves rest in that time. I have to put a limit on how late I'll work. I'm like, no, I'm done. I got to turn that computer off, turn the lights out. Years ago, it kind of happened for you. When there's no light, you can't turn on the computer. You stopped because it was dark. But I think a big mistake we do is we work late in the night. We eat late in the night. And how many of us stay up late and then we're hungry again? But typically, the late night things are bowl of ice cream, sugary things. So now, instead of nighttime being our body's time to mend, which it does, it repairs stuff in our brains, heals our gut, heals our body. It's our healing time. But now, if we're digesting food or we've gone to bed angry and we're worrying about things, those are things that our body can't do what it was supposed to do. So we need to think about giving our body that rest and trying not to eat real late at night. God gave us that rest to heal us, to bless us, to rejuvenate us, to strengthen us.
We've been taking that more seriously as we come home from church, and then we just kind of get together. And if we need to nap, we nap. If we just want to watch a movie, watch a movie, read a book, we read a book. But it's like, I'm not planning to do anything.
Right.
And I tell my kids, there's no chores today, guys. We're not doing anything.
Yeah, it's important. It's very, very important. A scripture the Lord gave me a few months ago when I was getting ready for one of my cooking classes. Jesus says, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink, because even the lilies of the field or, the birds in the air, they neither toil nor labor, yet they have food and God clothes them. And when I read that first part about don't worry about what you eat or what you drink, at first I was like, but Lord, is that what I'm doing though? Because I think and I make conscious efforts and I'm advocating eating healthy and eating real food. And God very quickly was just like, no, the people that are worried about what they're eating or what they're drinking, how many fat grams does this have in it? Is this gluten-free? Is this this? Is this that? How much sugar does this have in it? How much calories does this have in it? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Calorie counting, fat gram, sugar counting, all this counting only came into be when altered processed food came into be. Go in the produce section. There is no nutritional label on any of that. In the meat section, in the eggs, there's no nutritional labeling. And I told somebody the other day, I said, if obesity depended on calorie counting, what did they do for thousands of years when it wasn't an issue? They had no idea how many calories were in that food. First of all, they were burning them up from walking everywhere. But the food they ate was real. And that's what God showed me. He's given us, it says, He's clothed them and He's fed them. God gave us food to perfectly nourish our bodies. And we altered it and messed with it. And now we have to worry about, oh dear, does this have too much fat? Does this have too much sugar? Does this have too many calories? That's worrying about our food. Eating real food, people are always going, look, they're asking me these questions. I'm like, I don't know. How much bread do I need? I don't know. Just eat what you want, You're not going to be able to overeat it. It's going to fill you up. And this is one of my favorite quotes, and I do not remember where I read it, and I kind of altered it a little bit. But eating great food, no matter how simple or elaborate, should be one of life's greatest pleasures, not an endless guilt trip.
That's good. Wow, that's
and we all just fret about guilt of eating, and yet God gave us food that is so delicious, so nourishing to our bodies, and it's a pleasure to eat it. I love watermelon, on a hot summer day, cold bowl of, chunks of watermelon. It's just so delicious. There's just so many good foods, and it should be just one of life's greatest pleasures. Fellowship is always around eating. It's part of breaking bread. In fact, companion. Do you know what that word means? No. With bread.
Oh, really?
With bread. It's the Latin word. It means with bread. Panos is bread. With bread. Think about that. You can eat an apple by yourself. You can eat other foods by yourself. It's hard to make one roll, or one pancake. When you make bread, you make enough to share. That's what life is all about, sharing our bread, our real bread, our physical bread, our spiritual bread with others. It should be one of life's greatest pleasures.
So I have two questions here kind of rolled into one. Is there any such thing as healthy whole grains in the grocery store? And what is the difference between whole wheat, whole grain, and so on?
Healthy whole grains in the grocery store? Not really. I'm talking about the commercially made whole grain bread. There may be some that are independent bakeries like ours at Whole Foods. My son's bakery sells his bread there. It's ground fresh. There's 6 ingredients. It's the freshly milled whole grain flour, extra virgin olive oil, raw unpasteurized honey, yeast, natural mined mineral salt, water. There you go. I'm like, there's one other. And we don't even compromise on the salt. But the problem is in the big commercially made bakeries, whole grain flour is a legal term. When the steel rolling mills came on the scene in the early 1900s, virtually all other milling methods went out of business. When I first started doing this, you'd hear a lot about stone ground whole grain flour. That was the distinctive quality of freshly milled flour. It was a stone mill instead of the steel rolling mills like came on in the big commercial industry. So that was kind of, you knew that, oh, okay, this is real whole grain. Not necessarily the case anymore. When those steel rolling mills came on the scene that could produce massive volumes of flour and sifting the coarser bran and germ away, leaving only white flour, that's what happened. All other milling methods, as far as big commercial milling, what we see day to day in the grocery store, was gone. So when in like the 90s, I guess, and probably even a little bit before then, when whole grains kind of made a big comeback, it was kind of like, we've got to come up with what can legally be called whole grain flour, because there were no whole grain mills out there, big, commercial mills. So they came up with a formula of how much bran and germ must be added back to the white flour to make whole grain. And so it became a legal term. It became a legal ratio that you had to put so much. In America, supposedly, it has to have the same that it had in the original flour. Herein lies the problem. So to be labeled whole grain, the first ingredient must be that whole grain flour. Now, the problem is if you look at the third or the fourth ingredient, this is going to be a lead-in to the next subject, they let them add massive amounts of, well, I say massive, it's the third or fourth ingredient, so it's a pretty good amount, of gluten, okay, pure gluten. And I'm like, why? Then you just messed up the fiber to flour ratio, because gluten is the protein portion of that white flour, of the endosperm of the wheat. What are we doing there? Well, now it's like adding white flour, really. It's except it's the pure protein part. So therein lies the problem. Go in the grocery store. This is what I tell everybody. Pick up your most expensive 100% whole grain bread and read the third or fourth ingredient is typically gluten. So you're not going to see constipation eliminated because you just messed up the fiber to flour ratio. Why can they do that when they've legally had to meet this legal standard ratio to be whole grain? Gluten is not considered flour in the baking industry. It's an additive. So then look at all the chemicals that are in there as well. And I've bought, as visual aids, some reputable bakery 100% whole grain breads. One of them is back there on my shelf. It's never been refrigerated, never been frozen. It just sits back there. It is over 6 months old now. It's never molded. It's squishy. It's whatever. The last loaf I had was over 1.5 years old. It never molded. It finally just started disintegrating. It almost looked like dust from, say, foam, that disintegrates when it gets old, or something like that, that just starts disintegrating. In fact, I kept going, where's this dust on the top of my boxes coming from? And it was coming from this loaf of bread. It never molded. It was still squishy. So that should let you know something. So no, I don't think you can buy healthy whole grain bread. And that's where I think some of the anti-grain propaganda comes from. When they say, patients or people buy this healthy whole grain bread and their blood sugar is still high, their heart disease, they have all these issues. And when they go off of that, they get better. Well, I'm kind of inclined to agree with that thinking, except that that's not really whole grain, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real grain made from freshly milled whole grain that that none of that bran and fiber has been sifted out. All your oils are in there. All the nutrients are there. And not a bunch of junk has been added to make it sit on the shelf forever and ever. So, it's not just what they're doing to the flour, which is bad enough. It's all the stuff that they're adding to the bread as well. Also, you can go on the USDA website and white flour, whole grain flour, rye flour can all be exposed to chlorine derivatives to help bleach it from oxidation, the yellowing that oxidation causes. It can all be exposed to benzoyl peroxide, potassium bromate, which is a flour conditioner. So it's very different than what you're milling yourself. Whole wheat flour that you buy in the store typically has had most of the bran, all of the germ, and all of the oil removed, or it wouldn't sit on the shelf for a long, long time. That's why when you bake with that 100% whole wheat flour that you buy in the baking shop, that's why it's very gritty, very coarse. It usually has a bitter flavor. It's not good. You typically have to add some white flour to get a soft product. That's why it's very different from what you're milling fresh. First of all, it's stale and it's had things removed from it, and for shelf life purposes, they have to take that out. And then made with whole grains, that's a funny one because Wonder Bread is made from whole grains, So that one is usually.
Of course it is. I mean, they have
that's
to
usually
crack open all the grain.
Yeah, and they put the caramel.
Get to it.
Yeah, they put the caramel coloring in there, and if you, and then dust it with oats, and you think, wow, or multigrain. Those are deceptive labeling. Jedi mind tricks or whatever you want to call it.
Marketing strategy.
Marketing strategies
I like Jedi mind tricks.
Jedi mind tricks it is whole grain.
It is whole grain. It is.
And you think that it is, but if you read the label, it's enriched white flour most of the time with just, yes, it may be made from wheat, it may have some other grain flours in there that are white. They've had the bran and germ stripped out of them as well. So those are things you read labels, buy from a local reputable bakery that is milling your grain. Farmers markets are real popular now, and most of the bread out there is not made with whole grain, even though it looks pretty and you think, oh, this is an artisan bread. It's, most of the time it's white flour. So outside of milling your own, the only way to really get real whole grain flour and bread products is buying from a local person that is making it yourself. But that's the only part about my healthy eating strategy that you have to do some steps to get it. We've come a long way since the 90s when I started. You can now buy organic produce in the grocery store. You can buy most any kind of real food in the regular grocery stores that you shop at, except for bread. You can, except for a grain product. You really can.
And everything that you just said, I also heard you say the big word, gluten. It's like the word of the
hour.
Yes.
The day, the years now.
Yeah. What is gluten? Why are so many people afraid? I mean, I know that we've talked about it a little bit already, but I think that one thing that they don't understand is what it is and necessary nutrient that it is for our bodies.
Right. Yes. That's what most people don't realize. Technically, grains don't have gluten, okay? Gluten is something that is formed when the proteins in the flour get hydrated. And they form this stretchy substance called gluten. It's actually the hydrated proteins. So there are some grains that have this particular structure of proteins that when you grind the flour and you wet that flour, they better form this stretchy substance called gluten. So technically grains don't have gluten, but it's easier just to say this is a gluten-free grain. I like to say it's a gluten-forming grain. Wheat is the king. That is why wheat has endured throughout history as the best bread-making grain of all. barley and spelt, they were considered inferior grains in biblical days. You made barley cakes, but you didn't make a yeast bread from barley. Wheat has the highest protein structure that will form gluten when those proteins are hydrated. There's 3 parts of a kernel of grain. There's your bran, which is the outer few layers. That's where most of your vitamins, minerals, enzymes, even organisms are there. Your germ is the most interior part. It's got your fatty acids, richest food source of vitamin E, or your grains there in the germ. That's where your sprout comes from. That's where the life of the plant comes from. The rest of it, which is about 85%, I think is the percentage, is something called endosperm. Protein and starch. That's all it is. That is what white flour is. Protein and starch. Those proteins, very important to our body. We need them. We need those proteins. We need those amino acids. There's some very, very important ones. Glutamine, you hear the little catchy part there. Brain food, proteins in your brain are glutamine. Very important for logical thinking.
I had actually read a study, and I was looking for it in preparation for this, and I couldn't find it, so I'm going to continue to look. But in another country, they're actually using gluten supplements for infants that are born with brain disorders.
Oh. Yes, they are. I will try to find that because I think I have that information too.
Okay.
I've read that study. They're using it very effectively. They also use it for alcoholism, drug addiction, people with severe sugar cravings. The glutamine is used for that. Glutamine powder, that's used in this country to heal the gut lining. What? Wait a minute.
Yeah.
We read that gluten destroys the gut lining. Okay. Here's the issue. You ready for this? White flour that we've now been consuming for over 100 years predominantly. And you maybe say, oh, no, I never buy white bread. Well, we just talked about the whole grain bread that you may buy has gluten added to it, pure gluten. Okay, how do they get that pure gluten? You can take kernel of grain. In fact, my kids used to do this. You can take that wheat and you can wet it and soak it, and the germ will basically disintegrate kind of from wetting it. You can do it in your mouth. My husband and children used to do this on road trips. Pop some wheat, just a handful of wheat in their mouths, soak it, and ended up just chewing and chewing and chewing. Eventually, you get rid of all the bran, and you're left with this rubbery bubble gum, almost like you can blow bubbles with it, and they would see who could blow the biggest bubble with the gluten, the pure gluten. So they do this in the food industry. They disintegrate it and they wash it where there's nothing left but the gluten, this stretchy substance that then they dehydrate and powder it, and it looks like flour. We sell it here at our store,
Oh, yes.
And it's what you can add to bread. What does it do? It's forms this stretchy substance that traps the gas that the yeast produces in yeast breads, and that's what enables the bread to rise, making this fluffy bread, okay? So white flour, not only did they find that sifting the bran and germ away made the flour be stable, shelf stable, but white flour makes this fluffy bread because there's nothing there but the gluten and the starch. White bread's been around since the beginning of time. They learned this years ago, that they could make sifters, out of papyrus or, then later out of metal, and they sifted the bran and germ away manually like this. But white bread wasn't nearly what it is now, was usually reserved for wealthy people, kings, that had bakers, had servants that could sift this for them and sift the bran and germ away and make white, fluffy bread. The dark whole grain bread that we're now all clamoring for was known as peasant bread. That's where you get that peasant bread or harvest bread or whatever. The poor people had that, and they longed for the white bread of the rich people. But there's a scripture that talks about this. Proverbs 23 says, be careful when you sit down to the king's table. Do not crave his dainties and his delicacies. They're deceitful food. And I laugh and say, what do you think his dainties and delicacies are? I'm saying it's white flour fluffy things,
right?
So it's been around, but it wasn't until the 1900s when those steel rolling mills came on the scene. And we're a part of pretty current history here. For the first time in the history of the world, white flour, white bread, the king's dainties and delicacies became food for everyone. And it was cheap food. And the next thing you know, 3 diseases became epidemic shortly after. Beriberi, which is a B1 deficiency. Pellagra, which is a B3 deficiency. Beriberi results in nervous disorders. Pellagra is your B3, that's your niacin. That was known as the disease of the 4 Ds. Dermatitis, dysentery, dementia, and death. Really plagued the southeastern United States that depended very much on wheat for our food. First case was actually diagnosed in Atlanta, Georgia in 1907 of pellagra. And then anemia. All of a sudden, outbreaks, epidemic proportion, till they eventually figured out that it was the lack of those B vitamins that were now lost and missing from the new white flour on the market. Government mandated that you got to enrich this flour because we've lost this. Now, it was not until 1948, though, that government mandated you must enrich the flour. They were to put 4 vitamins back in, of them who knows how many. Early days, I said 25 to 30. I think I now say 35 to 40. It's countless. Who knows the phytonutrients that are there that actually are very synergistic and make those vitamins and minerals that we know are there accessible to your body. But 1948, it was government mandated. They had to put 3 B vitamins and iron back in the bread. And that's what's called enriched. Now, no fiber was put back in. No vitamin E put back in. The countless other vitamins and minerals and, that we lost, because any textbook is going to show you vitamins and minerals are all in the bran, they're all in the germ. Virtually, white flour is protein and starch. And then in 1998, they made them add, government mandated, they had to add a 5th nutrient, folic acid. 50 years of watching the rising incident of birth defect. Why did they put it in the flour? Because that's where it was lost from. So for all these vitamins and minerals and fiber that we lost, they put 5 back in, and we call that enriched. And as a food scientist, I read that enriched, and I thought, wow, they did me a favor. It's just not so. We're missing so many vitamins and minerals and fiber that are so critically important to our bodies. So up until the 90s, we predominantly ate white bread. And America, we fell for it. We're like, wow, hallelujah. And I get it. Households were larger then. Women were grinding by hand, farm hands, and lots of children. And wow, I don't have to grind my grain anymore. Hallelujah. They either did that, or communities were built up around the local miller that maybe when wind and animal power came in, they could grind larger volumes of flour, but people were still, they were still buying locally and using it up very quickly. So when these diseases became epidemic, and then they started enriching the flour, okay, supposedly they took care of beriberi, pellagra, and anemia. But I always ask the question, how many nervous disorders do we have in this country today? How many bowel eruptions, skin eruptions, mental insanity do we have in this country? Anemia, people are just tired. And now a whole host of diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes. These are real critical problems. And now come on the scene, and gluten is the bad guy. When what we really need to start realizing is we've been eating a diet of gluten and starch for lots of years. And now we have weakened immune systems, weakened digestive systems, and all these problems, and we're going to blame it on wheat and gluten? How about, how about all the stuff that's missing from it? And so that's what we've got to start realizing. And I just have to be the myth buster here on some of this. First of all, so gluten is nothing more than proteins, which are long strands of amino acids that your body needs. And it gets some of them very specifically from wheat, from the ones that form gluten. We need them. So we don't want to get rid of them, but we just don't need to be eating them outside of the context of the bran and germ. Now, wheat is not genetically modified in America. It is not. There were trials done. There is genetically modified seeds developed. The trials were stopped. They have not been reinstated. There is widespread resistance from farmers themselves against genetically modified wheat. Wheat has been bred by traditional breeding methods. It is crossbred. It is bred with other wheat strains. That is done. The difference in the way it's been done throughout history was it was accidental. It was natural. People get all hepped up about emmer wheat. Einkorn is considered to be the most ancient of all wheat strains. Well, it bred naturally with goat grass, and that gave you emmer. Emmer bred naturally with some other type of grass, and that gave you spelt. And it goes on and on. So today, it's done deliberately. They see a strain over here that they like. This has some good growing qualities. Hey, this is producing the gluten content that we want, or the types of, there again, it's the types of proteins that we want that will develop that gluten. Let's breed these. This is a hardier breed. The whole thing about the dwarf wheat, that was some work done to try to develop a wheat that would grow and produce good yields in very adverse growing conditions like Mexico, hard, rocky soils, hot climates. So this was what they did. They came up with a high yield crop because of starving people. So they developed this one. Well, the tall amber ways of grain, because of the bigger heads of grain, it was falling over and literally rotting in the dirt. So they crossbred it with a dwarf wheat that was a shorter plant and therefore higher yielding. And it was actually done in the 60s. And here's the deal. If this is the demise of America, this dwarf wheat was actually accepted worldwide in the 60s. Other countries use this too. So what's the deal there? It is not genetically modified. Again, widespread resistance of farmers in our country. America is the #1 exporter of wheat in the world. The major importers of our wheat will not allow genetically modified grains in their country. If we lose this ability to import grain into these major countries, you talk about an economic disaster in our country, it will be. And the farmers don't want this, and they know this. In fact, a number of years ago, you may have read, but what about the genetically modified wheat that was found in the Oregon wheat farmer's field? Yeah, he was irate about it too, wanted to know how it got there. And lawsuits were pending, and a huge financial settlement was made. So it's not to say sit back and not worry about it, because the powers that be that want genetically modified seeds for control or whatever, they're still there and they will continue, and we need to, as consumers, fight for that. But know that farmers are fighting as well. Again, I just can't stress enough, the gluten, the stretchy substance, is formed from the proteins that naturally occur in the grains. And what we must do is eat it in the right proportions and not just the isolated protein and starch. Another thing that I've got to say is that protein content of grains depends more on the growing conditions than it does on genetics. Yes, the type of proteins that are there, that's genetics, but rainfall. You get a lot of rainfall in a season, you're going to have a much lower protein content. Think of the southeastern United States. We cannot grow hard wheat here. You can take my hard wheat seed that we sell here, and you can plant it and it'll grow. And you've got all the genetics of hard wheat. That is a hard wheat is your higher protein that has the gluten forming proteins that you have to make yeast bread. You can plant it here in the southeastern United States. You will not get hard wheat because of the hot, humid, rainy growing season that we have here. It's going to produce a much higher moisture content, lower protein content, and you won't make yeast bread very successfully out of it. Some flatbreads, yes. Soft wheat is what grows here. It's a high moisture, lower protein grain. That's what you use for pastries. That's your pastry flour. That's why Southerners are known for what? cakes, pies, and biscuits because that's the wheat we had available. And when people can wrap their head around that and think about this logically, it will begin to make sense. What we're seeing in this country today that's being called celiac disease from years of eating pure gluten, pure starch in white bread, crackers, cookies, cakes, and all these things, we now have poor digestion, lack of those good organisms to clean up the digestive tract, our bowels in particular. You have constipation, this stuff's laying in your gut, not being eliminated. It's going to lay down that villi. And we have all the symptoms that look just like celiac disease, but it's not true celiac disease. I can't tell you the countless people that we're seeing diagnosed with celiac disease in their later years, which true celiac disease, it's genetic, you're born with it, you're usually diagnosed by the time you're 10. That's a serious disease, and I don't care if you mill your grain yourself or not, you'll never be able to eat wheat or any type of grain that have gluten forming potential because of you cannot digest the specific proteins are there. But all these people that are being told they need to go gluten free and gluten is the Antichrist or whatever you want to call it. I honestly almost agree with them to a degree, except it's not the gluten, it's the processed bread. Right. And I'm like, yeah, I've been telling you, it causes every disease under the sun. But it's not the gluten, it's what's being done to the flour and the bread. That's what you're eating, pure that. And we've seen so many people that if they're not a true celiac, a genetic celiac, I call it non-genetic celiac disease, you can reverse that. And we have seen so many people that start milling their flour. They've been told they have to go gluten-free because, I can't tell you how many people say, oh, as soon as I eat any gluten, I get doubled over in pain. And I don't deny that they have that. They try our bread reluctantly and fearfully sometimes, and they go, this didn't bother me at all. This is my message. I'm not trying to argue with anybody. I want to bring hope to people that think that they have to live this way the rest of their life. If you're not a true genetic celiac, this is reversible. Yeah, you may have to pull back a little bit, but it's reversible. And I have a quote by a very respected MD doctor, and he says, the overuse of antibiotics, anti-inflammatory pain relievers, Prilosec, Nexium, antacids, high sugar, low fiber diet causes the inflammation and the celiac and allergies. But then he goes on to say that's why elimination of gluten can prevent these things. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Gluten didn't cause those things. You now can't digest those proteins just like milk allergies. We can't digest those proteins because of what's being done to our milk. It's being pasteurized and those enzymes that help us digest those proteins are destroyed. And so, no, the key is let's quit having to overuse antibiotics, quit having to use so many anti-inflammatories, which people do not realize what that does to your gut. It causes bleeding in your bowels every time you take one. And people don't realize that.
Anti-inflammatory, like drugs like Advil
and ibuprofen. Everybody, and I can't remember when I'm taking one. And then Prilosec and Nexium, antacids. Okay, I got to explain this, and this may be a little technical, but I got to talk about this. Digestion. It begins when you smell the food. Your body starts going, whoo, this is going to be fun. Things are fixing to come in, and we like this. You start going, wow, what is that smell? And I want this. But, okay, getting back to specifics. Carbohydrate digestion begins in your mouth. When you chew your food, your saliva has an enzyme called amylase, starts breaking down carbohydrates. Once you swallow that food and it comes to your stomach, for all practical purposes, carbohydrate digestion stops. Protein digestion begins. The enzymes that digest proteins must have an acid environment to digest those proteins, to work, to be active. That's why God created our stomach with mucus producing cells that can protect our stomach lining from an acid that could eat a hole through this table. Okay, but then it also produces acids, brings the scientific pH down to 3. That's very, very acidic. Like I said, could eat a hole through this table. Okay, So that's what's happening. Protein digestion is going on in your stomach. Those amylase and carbohydrate digesting enzymes can't work in that acid environment. So protein digestion is going on in your stomach. Then when that's shunted over to your small intestines, then your pancreas dumps in those carbohydrate, fat digestion, your gallbladder puts some bile in there to help emulsify, break those fats down so they can be digested. So it all gets picked out back up again and completed, and then that's where your individual nutrients are absorbed. So where am I going with this? Okay. Proteins are digested what? In an acid environment. What is one of the number one drugs being prescribed today? Antacids. What do antacids do? They neutralize your stomach acid. You neutralize your stomach acid, what's going to happen? Those protein digestive enzymes are not going to be able to do their job. So now this is getting shunted over. Undigested food gets dumped into your colon. Undigested protein lays down the villi in your gut. And what did we say gluten is? Long strands of amino acids of proteins. So I'm not meaning to oversimplify, but before we start calling wheat the propagator of this whole anti-grain, anti-wheat information, I've heard him with my own ears say that wheat is the most toxic poison that we're putting in our body. Really? Since the beginning of time, every culture in the world has depended on wheat or other grains, corn, rice, whatever, for their life, to feed them. More than sodas, more than artificial sweeteners, more than all these things. And I think we need to come back and go, wait a minute, what's wrong with me that I can't break this down? Or what's wrong with all these other ingredients that are on this? Or what has been done to this food? Just like dairy. Dairy gets a bad rap, but what's been done to it? So we need to start looking at that. And that's what I think as people see more and more, they're going to understand that real whole grains are the most nutrient-dense food God has given us. And here is my very favorite of all. Deuteronomy 24, verse 6 says this: do not take a man's upper millstone as a pledge, for you would be taking his life. And in the early 1900s, we let somebody take our millstone, and they've been taking our life ever since.
I had a few more things that I wanted to talk about, but I know that we are probably pretty exhausted at this point. We've been here.
I could probably answer
talking
a couple more, but whatever.
A while. The one thing that I wanted to touch base on, and we can end with this, is about 10 years ago, you were diagnosed with cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I will. That was a shocker. Most shocking news I've ever experienced in my life. And that was in 2001. And of all things, it was colorectal cancer. And I questioned God many times, how in the world? I would go to the doctors, and you'd sit there, and on their walls, they would be charts of how to prevent colorectal cancer, eat whole grains, do that. I'm like, check. I'm doing all of those things. And supernaturally, and I won't have time to go into my whole testimony, but God sent strangers into my life, not complete strangers, but people that didn't know who I did or what I did, fasted and prayed and came and said that it was caused by anger and unforgiveness and bitterness. And I had studied it a little bit, the spiritual and emotional roots to disease. And as I said earlier, as surely as we're physical, we're spiritual. The book of James tells us, if anyone's sick among you, let him call for the elders to pray and anoint him with oil and confess his sins, and you'll be healed. And I don't want to say that every sickness is caused by sin, kind of like the blind person that Jesus healed, and they said, who sinned, his mother or his father or him? That's not a new concept, and it obviously is a truth, but Jesus said, no one. But in my case, I had gone through a pretty horrendous incident in my life. Very, very, very wicked things done in the name of the Lord. I had held on to those for about 10 years. It was just a conflict that I never really could get over. And after those people supernaturally by God showed me that, and someone else had talked to me about it even prior to them coming. It's a pretty remarkable testimony. We might have to do that whole thing another day, but God began to deliver me, and I began to confess unforgiveness and bitterness and forgive those people that had hurt me. But not only that, I recognized bitterness and unforgiveness as a sin. That was the bigger thing. I think sometimes we struggle. I will forgive. And even I had done that. But then when you all of a sudden get to a place where you go, you know what? I've held this and it's time to just let it go. And I let it go, and God healed me. I did go through some traditional medical treatment, but I know without a shadow of a doubt that God healed me. People that I know were very close to that were diagnosed with the same thing shortly after me, or even while I was going through it, they're not with us today. And they did alternative and traditional treatment as well. I know that God healed me. He told me that he did. And when they went in to take the tumor that had caused the problem, the tumor had grown so big that it had ruptured my colon and had actually seeped all that out into my body. You shouldn't be able to live but a few days with that happening. I've read all the things that say, oh, if you have a strong immune system, you won't get this cancer and all these things. And I believe that to a degree. But like I said, there's spiritual issues too, and I know mine was. And I believe it was my strong immune system from the bread, from the way I ate, and from the way I lived that kept me alive. I should be dead. And I know that. So yes, I hear what people say, and I get that, but I know that it was my immune system that kept me alive during that and helped me survive and gain my strength. God led me every step of the way. And I know people ask me, well, what did you do? Tell me what you did. Read the miracles of Jesus. Every one of them are different. He didn't just put mud in somebody's eyes, waited till Lazarus died and called him forth. He did this, that, and the other. It's different for everybody. And you have to look at your diet, but you have to look at your heart as well. God says, above all else, guard your heart. For out of it flow the issues of life. And I did. And when I had my final surgery to resect the tumor, to reconnect my bowel, I had to have a colostomy. The tumor was completely encased. There was no spread of it anywhere. They did biopsies on both sides of the tumor. They took lymph nodes all out of my abdomen area. There was none anywhere but that tumor. And
That's
I was
amazing.
healed.
That's amazing. 10
years. November was 10 years ago. May was 10 years that I had that surgery. I had a colonoscopy recently. No tumor, no polyps, no nothing. So it's been 10 years. I'm healed. He told me that it was finished. That was a promise that he gave me when I went through 7 weeks of confessing my sin, just taking it another layer. It was a glorious experience. I don't want to ever go through it again. So I encourage people, if you've got bitterness and unforgiveness, get rid of it, release it, let God just open the doors of your heart. That's what God showed me, that Abraham had dug these wells, and the Philistines, the enemy, had come in and filled up these wells. And it says that Isaac, his son, went back and unstopped those wells. And here's what I love, and gave them the names that his father had given him. And that was the scripture that the Lord used to tell me and to show me that there were wells in my heart that I had allowed the enemy to fill up, and that he wanted me to go and unstop those wells. And that when rename and name them the names, love, forgiveness, or whatever, the names that he had given them, and that when I would do that, my family would be healed, I would be healed, and out of me would flow rivers of living water. It's a powerful, powerful testimony.
I have heard your testimony, and it is amazing.
And I don't even share all in my testimony. I should write a book, because it was just countless ways he spoke to me, countless ways. And every day I would get up. I was weak, I was sick, I couldn't, in the beginning I couldn't even roll over in bed and get myself up. It was hard. But
I remember that time.
we've known each other.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time. But I remember having a conversation with Brad during the midst of that, and he had talked about one of your doctor's visits and how your doctor was just absolutely amazed that you were still alive, that you were actually able to go in and see the doctor at that point. I mean, you should have not been alive.
I should not have been, because it had been months with not knowing what was going on, seeing doctors, running blood tests. My CBC counts were fine. It was odd. Even in fact, the day before they opened me up, they never saw the tumor, and yet I was told it was as big as my fist. So actually, a doctor that I was seeing that was helping me so much, when I went in to him, well, he and Brad had a conversation, and he made the comment that, we may never know why Sue got this of all people. And Brad told him, yeah, we do know why. It was called bitterness and unforgiveness. And months later, I mean, it was in the fall after I'd gone through everything and had seen him and been seeing him, he actually went to a conference, and this is an MD doctor studying the emotional roots of disease. And so I went to see him for a follow-up. So he said, I want to sit down and talk to you. And he goes, I've been thinking about you. And he started telling me that he had gone to this conference. He said, at first I don't know, about emotional roots of disease. And he said, I started thinking about all the people that I see. And he does treat alternative, and he'll use conventional if he needs to. And the ones that I've treated successfully, he said, all had some type of spiritual encounter that God showed them something that they needed to deal with in their life. And he goes, they're the ones that were successful. And he said, I started thinking about you and people like you, and it really opened my eyes. And so then I remember smiling and looking at him going, okay, so what did you learn at this conference about colorectal cancer? And he said, a bitter, ugly conflict that you just can't get over. Which is exactly what the Lord had shown these people that didn't even speak English. They were the Brazilian congregation at our church that came in my home, didn't know bread Beckers. They didn't know what we did. They didn't know I taught people about pooping and colon health. And here this guy was a Christian, this doctor, but the work he was studying was by not a Christian. He had done it scientifically. And so he looked at me that day and he goes, above all else, guard your heart and keep doing what you're doing. Get rid of these issues in your life. So it was powerful.
What a legacy, though. Yeah. To know also, though, that you were the aid of this doctor learning this. And so think about his future patients.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Sue, this has been absolutely amazing. I know it has gone much longer than we had anticipated.
Yes,
I know that I could sit here and talk to you for the rest of the day, but
I do want to make one other comment about the gluten thing. We blame wheat, and we say that wheat consumption has increased. And I know the anti-grain propaganda, it says as our wheat consumption has increased, disease and sickness has, heart disease, cancer, all these things have increased. Wheat consumption has not increased in the last 100 years. It has drastically decreased. In the 1900s, the wheat consumption was 225 pounds per person per year. Today, it is 132 pounds per person per year. What has increased? Meat consumption has increased the average American 47 pounds more than we did 100 years ago. Sugar, 52 pounds per person. That is what has increased. These are things people need to know. Now, what has increased? If it's not wheat, what has increased? Prior to the 1900s, 90% of the flour was made at home and baked at home. It was used at home. In the 1940s, women started going to work. The grain mills came on the scene in the 20s. It dropped to 60% was used in the home. Our moms, baked cakes and things like that. 40% in the commercial industry. Today, less than 10% of flour is used in the home. 90% of what we're consuming is made commercially. That's the difference. And I felt like it's really important that we know that. Wheat consumption, grain consumption has not increased. It has drastically decreased. So, and in closing, I do want to say this: being healthy is not just about not being sick all the time. It's about having the energy to do what we're called to do, living a life for God, and being able to do that instead of being drug dependent, weakness and sickness and bedridden and can't hike the mountain or whatever. We just got to come back to that. And I know there's extenuating circumstances that we all have to go through and that we do go through, but
it's been amazing.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Boy, we covered some ground.
You sure did.
I'm gonna go home and go to bed.
I want the unedited
I'm hungry.
version.
Like all this food talking, I'm like,
I know. Do y'all want some Mexican? I have tons of Mexican left over. We can heat some up real quick and let's do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's it for today. Tune in next time as we continue to dive into life.
in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can find us at teaoflifepodcast.com or follow us on Twitter at teaoflifecast. Until next time, in the words of Monty Python,
Make tea, not war.